Hello VC and music lovers and anyone else who just happened to stumble upon this video. My name is Jeff. Welcome to Tone in Grooves. This video is going to, I haven't really come up with a title yet. Thinking like in the groove, in the grooves, maybe deep in the groove. I'm not sure yet. Haven't really decided yet. But basically I kind of was inspired to really delve into my collection and like actually listen to records. You know, hunting them down and collecting them is certainly fun, but what about actually listening to them and diving into the music and the sound in the grooves? And this kind of came about really as a, I was kind of inspired by, oh, what's the guy's name? He does, I watched his video on collecting classical records and a couple of other ones that he's done. Young guy, something like Poetry on Plastic, I think it is. Poetry on Plastic. And he did a really long, very in-depth, very interesting, very well done video on classical records. And I was really inspired by that, and he was talking about different labels and the sound quality of different labels. And I have a pretty, well, compared to some, it's a very small collection, but for me, I see it, I mean, it's a pretty good collection of classical records. Many of them I picked up in a large lot. There was some people who were, a couple who was selling some records, you know, a little bit at a time at a local antique store, and I got to talking to them, and they were like, you know, we've got tons more of these records, like back at the house, and they brought them all into town so I could look through them, and I ended up buying, this was a couple years ago, I ended up buying hundreds of classical records. They were in fantastic condition. A lot of them were promo copies from a radio station apparently, and anyway, so I ended up with like multiples of, you know, like the same symphony, the same concerto on different labels. And so when I saw Poetry on Plastic's video, it was like, you know, I think I'm gonna like dive into that collection of classical records and see what I've really see what I've got and do some comparisons and just have some fun with that. And so I'm gonna share some of the results in this video. That's where this is at. And so it's all about the tone in these grooves. It's about getting in the grooves. So I'll decide on the title before I post this. But anyway, so to start off, this is all, we've got some Brahms and some Mahler. And this was really fun. I really enjoyed doing this. Poetry on Plastic, I mean, he highly recommends the RCA label, especially the Living Stereos, the Shaded Dog labels specifically. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of Living Stereos. I have a lot of the mono copies, but anyway, let's just dive in. Now I'm starting to ramble. So the first little comparison I did was between two copies of Brahms Concerto No. 2. One is, they're both RCA. First one is this mono copy here of the Chicago Symphony. Oh man, I'm gonna murder some of these performers' names. Emil Jalels. Someone can correct me on that if I'm wrong. And it's a mono pressing, and usually I'm all about the mono, you know, so that's kind of my thing. It's a red Shaded Dog. Now I use, just to clarify, I mean, I have a very entry-level turntable. It's one of those Audio-Technicas, whatever, LP 120s or whatever. I did do a little upgrade by, I bought a mono, specifically mono cartridge for playing mono records. It's a Ortofon 2M mono, which has been a great cartridge, so I use that to listen to the monos. I thought this had really nice sound. The sound state is very front forward, as I guess you would maybe expect with mono. Had a lot of wide dynamic range. I was really kind of impressed and surprised by that. But also, to me, sounded a little bit muddy. But I really enjoyed the sound on that one. the comparison I actually have is one of the few living stereos that I have. It's also an RCA living stereo. This is, again, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. Eric Leinsdorf conducting, and I'm probably gonna murder this name. Sviatoslav Richter, performing. Let's see if I can get a. YouTube's gonna want a nice picture of me. There we go. Sviatoslav Richter. It's Brahms Concerto No. 2, Chicago Symphony Orchestra, living stereo. It's a red shaded dog. Living stereo. Oh, I got some. There's that. This record literally blew me away. The sound on this record is absolutely amazing. The mono copy's 1958. This living stereo is 1960. I'm early stereo records for me. I mean, I'm used to, the Beatles, where the stereo is really, this weird, like, all the music in one channel and the voices in the other, or like everything except the drums in one side and the drums on the other. Those really bad stereo creations, from the mono. So I was completely blown away by this. This stereo recording sounds amazing. It has a beautiful sound stage, just a wide sound stage. Huge dynamic range. The bass on this, the bottom end is deep. The highs are crystal clear. It's an amazing sounding recording. When I heard this, I was just completely blown away, and it was like, oh my gosh, I totally understand why people collect these living stereo records and why they go after these and why these go for big money. Totally blown away by that. This is an amazing album, amazing record. Sounds fantastic. The tone in these grooves is superb. It's just phenomenal. So that was kind of an interesting little experiment. The next thing I did was with I have Brahms Symphony No. 3 on a number of different records. First up is it's a RCA. It's a red shaded dog. This is Fritz Reiner and the Chicago Symphony Orchestra. It's a mono copy, red shaded dog. Then I also have a box set of Brahms 4 symphonies. This is on Columbia. The Columbia. This is that label here. I don't know if you can see that. Getting used to. I'm actually using my camera to record now, so I'm not used to. This is Leonard Bernstein, it looks like, and the New York Philharmonic from 1973 on Columbia. And then the final comparison is actually what's playing in the background right now. This is a CBS. This is digital recorded from 1984. With let's see here. It's the New York Philharmonic Zubin Mehta. So I don't know if that's correct or not. Someone can please correct me if I'm wrong. New York Philharmonic on CBS, digital recording from 1984. So those were the three that I compared. The RCA Shaded Dog sounds really good. The mono sounds nice. Has a nice, a really decent dynamic range. Again, that kind of nice, kind of the orchestra is right there in front of you. A little bit muddy to me is the downside, was how that sounded. But it also is definitely, you sense you get a nice sense of space, it sounds like you're in a music hall. So there's a nice sense of space on this recording, which is really cool. The Bernstein, the Columbia set, I was really disappointed in that. Again, why I didn't, to me, I mean, you had a little bit of that sense of space, not nearly as much as on the RCA record. The sound field was really wide, as if like, I mean, almost too far left and right to me. Like, I mean, it was almost a little bit of that, like those Beatles stereo records in a sense. You know, some instruments way over here on the left and some instruments way over here on the right, and not as much in the center. So a really wide sound field, but almost too much. And the sound on this, as far as dynamics, is very thin. It's a very thin recording, very disappointing. The CBS, the digital, I was surprised by this. I actually enjoyed this recording the most. The dynamic range is fantastic. Deep lows, crisp highs, a great, phenomenal like separation of the instruments. I mean, you could really hear the individual instrument sections, very different from the RCA, which was a little bit muddied. So very clear, very distinct, a wide dynamic range. The downside was, it's digital, and so I guess you would expect it does sound a little flat or condensed or compressed. You know, it doesn't have that sound like you're in a hall, which maybe, I don't know if that's the digital or if that's just where it was recorded, if it was recorded in a studio instead of a hall. Yeah, so that was my kind of take on the CBS. The vinyl on this is whisper quiet, super quiet. So, and I actually, I'm going to say I prefer this. It's what's playing right now in the background. I prefer the way this sounds. I really like the separation of the instruments, the detail, if you will, and that really wide dynamic range. But this sounds really great. This sounds really good. It's hard. I mean, obviously, I wouldn't argue that one necessarily sounds better than the other. They definitely sound different, and they each have their pros and cons, or pluses and minuses. This one has that nice kind of spacious sound, like you're in the hall, which this does not. This lacks. It really does. But I prefer the wide dynamic range of this recording and the crystal clarity of the separation of the instruments. So, if you could find a recording of this, and it's a fantastic symphony. I'm really enjoying this Symphony 3 by Brahms. I mean, if you could find a recording of that, and maybe someone can suggest one to me, because I would love to find one that has, the dynamic range, and that, separation of instruments that this recording has, along with, the spaciousness of sound, like you're in the hall, that this record has. So I'd be looking for that. Last up is Mahler Symphony number 1, and I had 3 different versions of that, or recordings of that. First one's on the None Such label. This is the London Symphony Orchestra, Yasha Hornstein conducting. And, I mean, we all know that label. There's the None Such label. And second was, I've got another CBS digital recording of that from 1980. Let's see, I couldn't find a date on the None Such, so I don't know. This CBS is 1986, it looks like. 1986. This is the Wiener Philharmonic, Lauren Mazel conducting. Conduct me if I got that wrong. Correct me if I pronounced that wrong. Yes, conduct me. And then the third one was the only other classical living stereo I have. This is, and it's a Dynagroove. This is the Boston Symphony Orchestra, Eric Leinsdorf. It's a red shaded dog. Living stereo on the Dynagroove label. So, impressions between these 3. I played the None Such first, and this sounded really good. The vinyl was quiet. I was surprised by that. I've heard or been told, in fact, I think Poetry on Plastic was saying that None such can sometimes be noisy vinyl, but this was really, really good, pretty quiet. A nice sound stage, you know, a kind of wide sound field, but not too wide. Decent dynamic range. I was really pretty impressed and pretty happy when I listened to that. The next one I listened to was the Dynagroove, the Living Stereo. Again, like the other Living Stereo, this sounds phenomenal. Just fantastic. Beautiful, you know, wide sound field, but not like to the extreme. Great. I mean, just fantastic dynamic range. The bottom end on this is literally, I mean, like room shaking. The double bass and the bass drums is just like, oh my gosh, it's so deep and so low. It's like I was afraid the neighbors were gonna complain. I mean, it's just amazing. And that nice sound, like spacious sound, like, you know, like you're in the hall. Phenomenal recording. I was so impressed. Both my daughter and I were listening to it at the same time, and both of us was like, wow, that sounds amazing. Based on the previous experience with the Brahms Symphony No. 3, I was really looking forward then to hearing the CBSs. I thought, man, you know, how is this going to sound in comparison? Because I really liked that other CBS. Disappointed. This one, the dynamic range isn't there. It's really kind of a weak sound. The vinyl is whisper quiet. I mean, as far as that goes, it's great. But the dynamic range is not there. Just the presence is not there. And again, it kind of has that kind of compressed sound to it. Not that kind of spacious sound like you're in the hall. So this one, I was disappointed in that. The RCA Living Stereo, absolutely amazing. Just sounds phenomenal. Just a fantastic record. So this was really kind of an interesting experience. Experiment, you know, very interesting experiment. Really enjoyed this. Both Mahler Symphony No. 1 is fantastic. Really like that, as well as the Brahms Symphony No. 3, and definitely those RCA Living Stereos are fantastic. Although it sounds like sometimes, to me, you know, these CBS Masterworks can sound really good, but sometimes really not. So I'm interested. I have a lot of these. A lot of these CBS Masterworks were in that lot of classical records that I bought a couple years ago. So I'm looking forward to spinning those and kind of diving into those and hearing how the rest of those sound. So anyway, chime in. Would love your comments, love your direction on great classical records, ideas, thoughts. Share your experience, share your wisdom. That's what's fantastic about the VC. Thank you so much for the subscriptions. My subscriptions have been climbing. I'm up over 75 now, I think. So on my way to 100. That's fantastic. Thank you all so much. It's really amazing that so many people have been watching and subscribing and commenting. I always love the comments. Really appreciate that. Thank you so much for your comments. And look forward to continuing the conversation on these records in this video. It'll be fantastic. Thank you very much for watching. Until next time, stay in the groove.